Okay, so the number one question I get from a lot of you is what is the responsibility of a record label and what areas of the music industry are not our responsibilities and should be left to the artist and their team? That's what we're going to discuss in today's video. I've decided to break down the music industry essentially into 10 categories, and we're going to address each of those 10 categories and ask ourselves, is this something a record label should be involved with, or is this something that we don't need to really be involved with? You can get the notes from today's episode by going to otherrecordlabels.com/record labels, because this is asking a very broad question of what do record labels do and what do we not really have to do? We're going to talk about recording, like mixing and mastering and tracking. We're going to talk about manufacturing and distribution and marketing. We're going to talk about touring and merchandise, lots of things. And I'm going to list these in order from the things that most record labels should really be doing, like very heavily involved, all the way down to the bottom where it's kind of optional or most record labels don't do this. And remember, of course, there's exceptions to the rules. I am speaking in a very broad sense. I'm thinking traditionally. I mean, listen, the original record labels were companies who manufactured machines that played recordings. And so they needed more of these recordings to sell more of the machines. And so then they went out across the country looking for people to record, and they would pay them or they would not pay them, and they would exploit them, take their performance, and then make multiple copies of it so that they could sell more machines. And so knowing that history, that kind of guides our decision making. Now, before I dive into this, I do want to say there's a caveat. Of course, most modern record labels operate completely different from the traditional model. To help anybody who's new and starting out a record label, I want to cover everything that we talk about today from a very general sense. So generally, traditionally, record labels are involved with X, Y, Z, and traditionally and generally, record labels are not involved with X, Y, Z. By the way, if you're thinking about starting a record label, you should download my free toolkit, which is a zip file that includes things like a checklist and workbook and a bunch of templates that you can use and super helpful stuff. I think it's important that we think about our responsibilities through the lens of selling records. I know that sounds kind of tacky and capitalist, but it's true. That's the origins of record labels, is selling records, putting our logo, our actual record label on a record or a CD or a tape, or even just in the fine print of our digital release. So everything that we're going to talk about today is through the lens of, does this help us sell records? Now, I know we do more than that. I know we help people. I know we give people a voice. There's so many more altruistic and beautiful things that record labels do, but it helps us clarify our role and some of the things that we may not have to do if we talk about it from the standpoint of, does this help us sell records? Number one, recording. And that includes tracking, also known as recording, mixing, and mastering. Is a record label involved with the artist recording process? Generally, yes. Traditionally, yes. Remember, does it help us sell records? Well, of course it does, because we're making those records and we're making sure that they were made great, and we're making sure that they were made to sound great. For major labels in the old days, they would give an artist a big chunk of change to go book studio time and session musicians and to pay a producer and to make a gorgeous sounding record with a lot of singles that will do well on radio. That model has shifted. It's still maybe a little bit. Maybe indie record labels will give artists a budget for mastering or for mixing. A lot of indie labels nowadays will actually just wait for the artist to bring them the masters, even if they record it in their bedroom. Maybe the label will help them get it mastered, or maybe the artist will just bring them the completed album and the label will just license it from them. But generally, labels are involved with recording, although you don't have to be. Today, I mean, obviously you need recordings, but today it's totally normal and very common for a label to start working with an artist after they've finished recording. So you don't have to be involved with that. But if an artist needs your help in finding a mastering engineer and maybe even needs some money to borrow from you to pay for a mix engineer or a mastering engineer, then yes, that is generally either the responsibility or falls under the umbrella of roles that record labels take on. Number two is distribution, and I'm also going to throw manufacturing, distribution/manufacturing. So let's say you manufacture the record. In some cases, that's making CDs or making vinyl or making tapes. Also, in a way, like you manufacture the digital files, like you get the WAV files ready and MP3 files for press, and then you distribute them. So Most commonly, we use a digital distributor to get it up onto iTunes and Spotify. But you may also have a physical distributor that gets your records into traditional brick and mortar retail stores. Or maybe you also sell them from your website. So yes, distribution and manufacturing is 100% something that record labels should be involved with, and are traditionally, and even today, modern record labels will be involved with the manufacturing and the distribution. Number 3, marketing. And here's what I'm going to put under the umbrella of marketing: PR, public relations, and like pitching albums to press, obviously. Social media, I'm even going to throw in there. And playlisting, like submitting and pitching singles to curators. We'll throw that in there as well. So marketing is definitely, remember, let's ask ourselves, does this help us sell records? Of course it does, in a huge way. Even if it's just to get streams for a single, that's still the same thing as selling records. And so marketing is 100% the responsibility of the record label. Of course, an artist or a band can be involved in the marketing. That's huge. If they have a manager and they're involved in promoting the album as well, that's huge. But primarily, it's the record label's responsibility. Now, that could be handling the PR on your own as in-house marketing. You have a list of blogs and curators that you send the album to, or maybe you hire a publicist. You don't have to hire a publicist, but record labels do that as well. Now, I want to talk about social media for a second, just because I'm going to put it under this umbrella of marketing. Now, some people ask me, is it okay for a record label to manage the artist's social media? Like, can I, as a record label, run my artist's social media account and even pretend to be them? I think it's tacky when you pretend to be an artist. I don't think it's very transparent or authentic. I think it's slightly unethical, even if the artist says it's okay. I think worst case scenario, a label can just run their Instagram, run their Twitter, and just retweet people talking about their album and posting ads and posting photos of the artist. That's what major artists do anyway, who aren't active on social media. They let their manager or their label do it. But the best and most effective is if the artist is running their own social media, even if they're not very good at it. If they're just posting pictures of their cereal and working on a new song, people would much prefer that than like stock photography or the label just posting ads. But it's okay if you do run your artist's social media. Just don't pretend to be them. I don't like that. So yeah, marketing falls under the purview of record labels. Let's move on. Number 4 is financial management. So when it comes to a record label relationship with an artist, I'm talking about budgeting and managing the budget for your album or your single. And so that would be your manufacturing costs, your recording costs, mastering costs, digital distribution, marketing if you have that, graphic design and photo shoots, anything that is used to promote the record. That would go into your album campaign budget or single campaign budget. So is that the responsibility of the record label? Again, generally, yes. Why? Because it helps you sell records. Managing your expenses and putting that up against your revenue, that profit is usually what you and the artist are going to split. So this is something that often falls on a record label. By the way, you should check out our directory, otherrecordlabels.com/directory. There's a great company called Infinite Catalog that we recommend to help you do all of your record label royalties. So you should check that out in our directory. I'll post a link. As a record label, you're not necessarily responsible for managing the personal expenses of an artist. That's something they should do on their own or with a manager or with their mom. For you, you should really just be focused on the expenses that are paid out by either you or the artist for an album or a new release, and then managing all the income that comes in from sync licensing or from Spotify or from Bandcamp. Number 5 is artist development. Now, you may have heard of artist development back in the 90s and 2000s, where a record label would sign like a 13-year-old Taylor Swift, and they would set her up with other songwriters and help her write music, and they would develop her image and, give her vocal lessons, that kind of thing. I'm not saying that happened with Taylor, but artists like that, like young artists in Hollywood or in Nashville, that model's kind of gone. It's like most people don't have that time to invest, and most artists are developing themselves on YouTube and on TikTok anyway. So by the time they come to a major label, they're already developed. So what does artist development look like for us as indie labels? And is this something that we're responsible for? Yes and no. No, in the traditional sense that you don't really need to pay for vocal lessons or that kind of stuff to develop an artist. I don't think that's really the way things are done anymore. But I like to think of a record label often plays the role of an advisor or a coach. Sometimes I might be telling my artist, don't waste your money on XYZ, or yes, XYZ over here is a good thing to invest your money in. I think record labels should make sure that their artists are registered with their local performing rights organizations so that they're getting their publishing royalties, even if there's nothing in it for their label. It's okay for a label to help with the personal expenses or just kind of like coach, like a parent or a friend, and say, here's some things you want to make sure you're not forgetting about. Now, does this help us sell records? Remember our big overarching question, does this help us sell records? Well, not directly, but sometimes some of these things indirectly help you sell records. And so a healthy artist, an artist who's organized, and an artist who isn't in debt and making bad decisions will probably be in a better position to tour and to write music and to produce music and to help everybody and to help their career grow. And that's good for you as a label. Number 6 is radio. We don't think about radio very much, do we? But I think a lot about college radio. In fact, remember I mentioned our directory? We have a great company called Tiger Bomb that helps you set up a college radio campaign, which is super cool. You can check them out. I'll provide the link again. I love college radio. My music still gets played on college radio. I've been to the local radio station here in town at the university, the college radio station. I love it. I love it there. It's really cool. Remember in the old days for like commercial radio, record labels, well, I'm not saying remember, like none of us actually remember this, but like you would take some cash and some cocaine and you'd go down and some records and you'd go down to the local FM radio station and be like, play these songs over and over and over. You know, here's your reward. We don't do that much anymore. I mean, I still do that. Yeah, I still do that. But that's not really common practice. Commercial radio is like next to impossible to get into, and it's not really, I'm not talking about that. Some more like non-traditional radio and non-interactive streaming radio like Pandora, and of course, college radio is something that we should pursue. And so is it the responsibility of record labels? Well, yeah, it's always been the role of a record label is to help get their artists' songs, their singles on radio, and it still is today. Even if that radio has evolved a little bit, even if it is Pandora, or maybe it's a YouTube playlist, it is still a responsibility because somebody could be hearing that song on the radio in the grocery store and use Shazam and be like, oh, I really like the song. And then they get linked to Apple Music or Spotify and they download it. So yes, it does help sell records. So radio is 100% something that record labels should be involved with. It may not be your top priority. You might be more focused on selling vinyl or getting on a cool Spotify playlist, but I still think radio is really cool today. I don't think college radio is going anywhere. You should talk to Tiger Bomb about that. We did an interview with them and we talked all about college radio. So anyway, college radio falls under your purview. It may not be your top priority. It may be your year 2 priority, but it is cool. Number 7 is merch. And by merch, I'm talking about like hoodies and t-shirts and stickers and tote bags and that kind of stuff. Is that your responsibility? Okay, well, as we get deeper into this list, some of these things are less and less the responsibility of record labels. So as a whole, no. I mean, you've heard about these 360 deals where record labels sign deals to say, we even want a cut of your merch, and we even want a cut of your ticket sales, and we even want a cut of if you were paid to star in a movie, we want some of that as well. We don't really play that game too much in the indie record label world. But there are exceptions when it comes to merch. For example, let's say you're selling records. Remember, we're selling records here. That's our job. And what happens if we have like a deluxe package on Bandcamp where you get the vinyl and you get the digital download and you get a t-shirt? Well, in that case, maybe we as a record label source the t-shirt supplier. We pay for 100 shirts to be made and we're selling them and shipping them. As long as you have an agreement with the artist, I think that's a normal and good way for record labels to get involved with merch, but you don't have to. And if an artist says, I want to make t-shirts, you might be like, I don't mess with t-shirts. I don't really have a good way to sell them. I don't have a warehouse to keep them. I think they're expensive. So in that case, you could just say, sorry, artist, you're going to have to figure this out on your own. You don't maybe see an indirect or a direct way that it can help sell records. Or what you can do, and I've done this in the past, I could say, I don't really mess with t-shirts, but I know a supplier and I'll hook you up. And so I've done that before where I've kind of helped the artist and they pay for it themselves. And maybe I send the artwork to the t-shirt company and just let them do it. Or I find an on-demand service and just say, hey, check this out. And maybe you could set up an on-demand thing through a big cartel store or through a Shopify store. But merch is not something you have to get involved with unless it helps you sell records. Moving right along, number 8, publishing. And I'm also going to include sync licensing. So Sync licensing, yes. And we did a big series on sync licensing last summer. And sync licensing does help you sell records, because if you get a song on a TV show, somebody's going to be listening to that. They might Shazam it. They might be like, hey, where's that song from? I like it. Go to Spotify, follow the artist, download the album, whatever, buy the vinyl, go to a show. So yeah, sync licensing. And also, remember, we went back to the origins of record labels. The origin was to exploit the masters. Have you ever heard of that? The masters is like the final album files that we make. And we might pay $10,000 to have those WAV files created. And so we want to exploit them as many ways as possible to get as much money out of those masters, not just through streaming, but also through physical media like vinyl and tapes, but also through sync licensing. So even though exploit the masters is a disgusting term, it still kind of applies. And so sync licensing is a great way to do that. Is it the label's responsibility? Not entirely, but it is something you should be doing maybe year 2 or maybe year 3. It's great. Publishing, on the other hand, is not something that record labels normally get involved with. Some record labels will eventually open a publishing arm as a way to make more revenue, but that's very complicated. It's not as easy as it seems. You actually need to have a system in place to collect those royalties. In some cases, you have to have software or personnel who know what they're doing. In fact, anytime you take a cut from an artist, you need to make sure you're earning that cut. You can't take money from their publishing if you're just setting them up with a third-party publishing administrator. Publishing is very, very complicated, and most record labels don't get involved with it. And when they do, they set up a second company with a different LLC and different people to run that company, and then they maybe take a cut from publishing. But in most cases, record labels don't really get involved with publishing. You may help your artists set themselves up with ASCAP or PRS or SOCAN or their local PRO just as a kind gesture. Maybe you even loan them the $300 it costs to register or whatever it costs in your country. Number 9 is touring, or like booking shows. You'd be surprised to know that most labels don't really involve themselves in this. They might lend you money to help fund your tour because they know you're going to sell records on the road, and they know people are going to go home and add you to their Spotify library. They might connect you with other tours from other artists on the label that would help promote you. But smaller indie labels don't really offer much tour support. They can't. And touring and booking shows is often left to the artist and their booking agent or their manager, or all three. Remember, the record label is really focused on making records, promoting records, selling records, and making more records, and getting those records into the ears and hands of music fans. And so, yes, that happens at touring, but it's not something you have to do. And personally, I'm not a huge fan of touring and live shows. The reason I started a record label, and even the reason I became an independent artist, was because I just wanted to emulate that feeling of holding a cassette tape in my hand when I was a little boy and buying it at the mall and taking the cellophane off, and later as a teenager with a CD and an adult with a deluxe vinyl record. I love that feeling, and I want to give that feeling to more people. So I never really messed with touring. I didn't help my artist book shows other than maybe like a showcase every now and then. So yeah, I mean, you can help your artists out with touring if you're passionate about touring, but you don't have to. Finally, number 10 is artist management. And really, this is not the responsibility of the record label. This is the responsibility of an artist manager. In fact, some record labels won't even sign an artist if they don't have a manager, because it's nice to have that like mediator, right? Now, with the exception of some of the things I've talked about in this whole episode, of the times where a record label kind of acts as a coach or a parent or an advisor to their artists. But like when it comes to the business side of things and kind of like managing their whole career, not just their catalog, remember, a record label kind of manages the artist's discography, their repertoire, where a band manager, an artist manager will manage a lot more than that. Their publicity, their image, their finances, their career opportunities, what record label they should go with. Anyway, so it's kind of recommended that an artist has their own manager. So that's kind of not really your responsibility. So listen, I hope that you found this helpful. Those are 10 categories, and maybe there's more categories I've kind of glossed over. I apologize, but this is a topic I get asked about all the time. Is like, is this something I need to be responsible for? Is this something I need to be responsible for? I think it's important because starting a record label can be so overwhelming. And if you find out there's things that traditionally you don't have to deal with, that's kind of nice. And you can focus on the things that you're passionate about and the things that record labels are more commonly responsible for. Go to otherrecordlabels.com/record labels, where you can get the notes from today's episode and kind of digest this a little bit more and read a bit deeper. And go to otherrecordlabels.com/toolkit, where you can download my free toolkit that gives you a ton of resources that will get you on your way to starting a record label. I hope you found this helpful, and thanks so much for watching.